Cutting their vision.
Oh, the burning pain, listening to your heart.